There is a moment in every person's life when they get tired of their own excuses. Not a little tired, deeply, completely, exhaustingly tired. That moment does not arrive with an announcement. It does not come with a warning or a countdown. It arrives quietly, sometimes in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, when you are sitting in the same spot you always sit, doing the same things you always do, and a thought cuts through the noise like a knife. You realize that nothing around you is going to change until something inside you changes first. Most people believe change is slow. They believe it takes years of suffering, years of planning, years of waiting for the perfect conditions to show up. But that belief is a lie they have been telling themselves to avoid making a decision today. Change does not require years. Change requires a moment. It requires you to stop negotiating with the version of yourself that is comfortable being average. It requires you to look at the life you have been living on autopilot and decide with total seriousness that you are done waiting. The protagonist of this story is not some fictional character living inside a book. This story is about a real human being who woke up one day and realized they had been sleepwalking through their own life. They had been going through the motions. Wake up, check the phone, go through the day without intention, collapse into bed, and repeat day after day, week after week, year after year. And somewhere deep inside, a voice had been screaming that this was not supposed to be the story. That voice finally got loud enough to hear. Autopilot is dangerous not because it destroys you quickly, but because it destroys you slowly. It keeps you comfortable enough to survive, but never uncomfortable enough to grow. You do not feel the damage in one day. You feel it across hundreds of days when you look back and realize you are in the exact same place you were a year ago. The habits are the same. The results are the same. The feelings are the same. And the worst part is that deep inside, you already knew what needed to change. You just kept choosing comfort over courage. That is the moment this story begins, not with a dramatic event, not with a crisis, just a decision. A quiet, firm, unshakable decision that the next 7 days are going to be lived differently. Not perfectly, not with some extreme overhaul of every single area of life, just differently, with intention, with awareness, with the kind of focus that most people only dream about but never actually practice. 7 days, one decision, a completely new trajectory. The first morning arrived and the old habits were waiting. The phone was right there on the nightstand, glowing softly, full of notifications, full of other people's thoughts, other people's opinions, other people's lives. The hand reached for it automatically, the way it had done every single morning for years. But something stopped the movement. A small but powerful awareness rose up and said, "Not today." That first hour of the morning had been getting stolen every single day, and most people do not even realize it is being taken. The first hour of your morning is the most valuable hour of your entire day. Your mind is fresh. Your willpower is at its highest. Your focus has not yet been scattered by the demands of the world. And most people hand that hour directly to their phone. They begin their day by reading other people's news, watching other people's highlights, reacting to other people's content. Before they have even stood up properly, their mental space has already been filled with noise that has nothing to do with their own goals. That is the theft that happens silently every single morning. So on this first day, the protagonist declared the first hour sacred. No phone, no social media, no news, no notifications, just intentional action from the very first moment of waking. The morning began with a full glass of water because the body had been without hydration for hours and the brain needed fuel before anything else. Then came movement, not a full workout, just enough to wake the body up, to shift the blood, to send a signal to every muscle and nerve that today was going to be different. The body needed to feel awake before the mind could lead. After movement came breathing, slow, deliberate, controlled breathing that pulled the nervous system out of stress mode and into clarity. Most people spend their entire morning operating from a place of low, great anxiety without even knowing it. The phone creates urgency. The rush creates cortisol. But intentional breathing resets all of that. It signals safety. It signals control. And from that place of control, the next step became possible, which was sitting down and writing goals. Not typing them. Writing them by hand, pressing the words into paper, feeling the weight of what was being committed to. Then came the most unusual part of the morning ritual. Speaking intentions aloud, saying out loud to no one but yourself what you intended to create that day, what kind of person you intended to be, what energy you intended to carry. It felt strange at first. It felt almost silly. But there is a reason that every high performer, every athlete, every leader who has ever studied the psychology of success knows that the voice carries power. When you hear yourself say something, your brain takes it more seriously than when you only think it. The protagonist spoke their intentions and felt something shift immediately. Chaos was replaced by momentum. The second day brought a different kind of challenge. Not about adding something new, but about removing something old. Every person who has ever tried to transform their life has made the same mistake of trying to overhaul everything at once. New diet, new workout plan, new morning routine, new productivity system, new mindset, all starting on the same Monday. And by Wednesday, all of it has collapsed because the weight of too much change at once is unbearable for the brain. The smarter approach is subtraction. Find the one habit that is doing the most damage and cut it. Just one. The protagonist sat down and looked honestly at their daily patterns, not with judgment, but with the eyes of a scientist examining data. What was the one behavior that, when it happened, made everything else harder? What was the one pattern that drained energy, wasted time, dulled focus, and consistently pulled the day in the wrong direction? For some people, it is the phone in the morning. For others, it is staying up too late. For others, it is saying yes to things they should say no to. The specific habit does not matter. What matters is the honesty to identify it. Once the habit was identified, the decision was made, not to reduce it, not to manage it, to eliminate it, and in its place, something constructive was installed, because the brain does not do well with empty spaces where habits used to be. If you remove a behavior without replacing it, the brain simply returns to the old pattern because it needs something to fill that slot. So the replacement was chosen carefully, something that served the same emotional need, but in a way that moved life forward instead of holding it back. And on that second day, something quietly but powerfully began to shift. The identity started to change. Not through what was added, but through what was removed. The third day was physical. And it was not about fitness in the way most people think about fitness. It was not about losing weight or building muscle or hitting any specific number. It was about something much more fundamental than that. It was about signaling to the body and the mind that this person was in motion, that they were no longer stationary, that they were no longer the person who sat still and let life happen to them. Movement was the message, and the message was power. The protagonist moved with intention that morning. It did not need to be perfect. It did not need to be an hour-long session with a professional trainer. It needed to be purposeful. It needed to be the kind of movement that made the body feel awake, alive, and capable. Because the body and the mind are not separate systems. When the body moves with power, the mind follows. When the posture straightens, confidence rises automatically. When the muscles engage, the mental state shifts. There is a direct physiological connection between how you move and how you think, and most people have never been taught to use that connection deliberately. After the session, something visible had changed. The way the protagonist stood was different. The shoulders were back. The chin was slightly up. The steps were more deliberate. These were not small vanity changes, these were signals. The body was beginning to move like someone who had made a decision, and that physical shift was feeding directly back into the mental state. Confidence is not just a thought. It is a feeling that lives in the body. And when you train the body to carry confidence, the mind begins to believe the story the body is telling. The fourth day brought a realization that was both obvious and shocking. The world is incredibly loud, and most of the noise is not serving you. The protagonist conducted an honest audit of everything they had been consuming on a daily basis. Social media was the first examination. Hours spent scrolling through content that ranged from mildly entertaining to deeply negative, none of which had anything to do with the life being built. News was next, and the news had been a daily source of anxiety without a single piece of information that had actually changed how the day was lived or what actions were taken. Then came the harder examination, the people, not strangers online, but real people in the daily environment, the conversations that consistently ended with a feeling of heaviness, the friends who responded to every new idea with doubt, the voices that, whether intentionally or not, pulled energy downward instead of upward. This was not about cutting people out of life with cruelty. It was about being honest about the energetic cost of certain interactions and choosing with intention where time and attention would be invested. The digital detox that began on day 4 was not extreme. It was not about throwing the phone away or living in silence. It was about replacing low-quality input with high-quality input. The scrolling time became reading time. The news consumption became podcast listening from people who were building, creating, and growing. The mental space that had been constantly cluttered with other people's opinions began to clear. And in that clearing, something remarkable happened. The inner voice got louder. The thoughts became clearer. The focus sharpened to a point where an hour of work produced more results than 3 distracted hours had ever produced before. The 5th day introduced a practice that separated people who dream from people who execute. Planning, not the vague wish list kind of planning where you write down 10 things you want to accomplish someday. The specific time-bound, priority-driven kind of planning that leaders and high performers use to protect their attention and direct their energy toward what actually matters. The protagonist had been winging it for too long. Each day had arrived without a clear structure and left with a feeling of being busy but not productive. The nightly planning ritual began. Before going to sleep, the protagonist sat down and wrote out the top 3 priorities for the following day. Not 10, not 20. The 3 things that, if completed, would make the day a genuine success regardless of what else happened or did not happen. These were written clearly, specifically, and in order of importance. Then the morning schedule was mapped. Not every minute, but the key windows when focused work would happen, when emails would be answered, when the most important task would be tackled while energy was still at its peak. The effect was immediate. Decision fatigue dropped significantly. Decision fatigue is real and it is costly. Every time you have to decide what to do next, you spend a small amount of mental energy. Over the course of a day, hundreds of those micro decisions drain the mind to the point where nothing important gets done with full focus. But when the day is planned the night before, you wake up knowing exactly where to direct your energy. The decisions are already made. The mental bandwidth is preserved for execution. The protagonist stopped being busy and started being effective, and that difference changed everything. The sixth day was designed to be hard, not accidentally hard the way most days feel hard because of poor planning or unexpected chaos. Deliberately hard, chosen difficulty. The kind of discomfort that a person steps into on purpose because they understand that growth does not live inside the comfort zone. It has never lived there and it never will. The protagonist woke up earlier than usual that morning, not to suffer, but to prove something to themselves, to demonstrate through action that they were capable of doing hard things before the rest of the world was even awake. The tasks that had been sitting on the to-do list for weeks, the ones that kept getting pushed to tomorrow, were the first things addressed, not because they were the most urgent, because they were the most avoided. And avoided tasks are not neutral. They take up mental space constantly. They create a low hum of guilt and anxiety that runs in the background of every other moment. Every time the avoided task crossed the mind, a small amount of energy was spent not doing it. Addressing it directly and completely was not just productive. It was a relief that freed up mental and emotional resources that had been tied up in avoidance. Then came the moments of speaking up. In conversations where the old version would have stayed quiet to avoid discomfort, the protagonist spoke. Not aggressively, not to create conflict, but with the clear, grounded voice of someone who had something genuine to contribute and was no longer willing to suppress it to make others comfortable. Every time that discomfort was chosen instead of avoided, something grew. Self-respect, not the fragile, performance-based kind that depends on what other people think. The deep, internal kind that comes from keeping promises to yourself and acting in alignment with who you are deciding to become. The seventh day was the day the voice changed. Not the speaking voice, though that changed too. The internal voice, the constant stream of self-talk that runs inside every human mind every single day, shaping how every situation is perceived, how every challenge is interpreted, how every opportunity is approached. Most people have never examined what their internal voice actually says. They have never stopped to listen to the language they use when they talk to themselves. But that language is not neutral. It is either building or destroying, and it is doing one of those two things every single moment. The protagonist listened carefully that morning to the automatic thoughts, the habitual responses that arose when facing a challenge. The phrases like, "I will try and I hope it works and maybe I can." These were the verbal signatures of a person who was not fully committed, a person who was leaving an exit door open, a person who was hedging their bets against their own success. And those phrases were replaced deliberately, consciously, one by one. "I will try" became "I will." "Maybe I can" became "I am doing this." "I hope it works" became "I will make it work." The language shifted from doubt to declaration. Identity-based language is not positive thinking in the shallow sense of that phrase. It is not about pretending everything is perfect or ignoring real challenges. It is about choosing words that align with the identity being built rather than the identity being left behind. When you say, "I am someone who gets up early," your brain begins organizing your behavior around that identity. When you say, "I am someone who does not skip training," your decision-making shifts accordingly. Words shape beliefs. Beliefs shape actions. Actions shape results. And it all starts with the internal conversation that no one else can hear, but that directs everything you do. While all of this internal transformation was happening across the 7 days, something external was also changing. The way the protagonist dressed began to shift, not because anyone told them to, not to impress anyone, but because they understood something that most people overlook entirely. The way you present yourself externally is a direct reflection of the standard you are holding for yourself internally. When you dress carelessly, you send yourself a message that you are not worth the effort. When you dress with intention, you send yourself the opposite message. You signal that the day matters, that you matter, that the mission is real. Putting on clothes that communicated purpose rather than laziness was not about vanity. It was about integrity. It was about matching the outside to the inside. Because when the inside was changing this rapidly, when the decisions and habits and language were all upgrading, having the appearance match that upgrade created a powerful sense of alignment. The protagonists began carrying themselves differently. The posture that had been improving through daily movement was now reinforced by how they dressed. The walk changed. The presence in a room changed, and people began noticing, not because the clothing was expensive or flashy, but because something in the energy had shifted. Something undeniable. The streak was not about being perfect across the 7 days. There were moments of struggle. There were mornings that were harder than others. There were evenings when the old habits knocked loudly at the door of the mind and asked to be let back in. But the streak was about consistency, not perfection. It was about showing up every single day and doing the work even when the motivation was low, especially when the motivation was low, because motivation is unreliable. It comes and goes based on mood, sleep, circumstances, and 100 other variables that cannot be controlled. But discipline is a choice. And every time the discipline was chosen over the feeling, the identity got stronger. Small wins stacked on top of each other in a way that created something much larger than any single win could have created alone. The morning ritual on day 1 felt like one small thing. The cut habit on day 2 felt like one small change. The movement on day 3 felt like one small session. But by day 5, day 6, day 7, the stacking effect was undeniable. Each small win had built trust. Trust in the self. Trust that when a commitment was made, it would be kept. And that trust, that self-trust, is the foundation of everything. Without it, confidence is just a performance. With it, confidence is a reality. The evenings became as powerful as the mornings. Before this transformation began, the nights had ended in a way that many people know all too well. Falling onto the couch, scrolling mindlessly until the eyes got heavy, drifting to sleep while still holding the phone, waking up the next morning already behind, already foggy, already reactive. The night had been an extension of the day's chaos rather than a recovery from it. That changed entirely during this week. A screen cutoff time was set, and it was honored without negotiation. At least 30 minutes before sleep, all screens went dark. Not because the content on those screens was necessarily harmful, but because the brain needs time to shift from the stimulated, reactive state that screens create into the calm, reflective state that allows genuine rest. In that screen-free window, 3 things happened. First, the day was reflected upon, not with harsh judgment, but with honest observation. What went well and why? What could have gone better and how? Second, gratitude was practiced, not as a performance or a spiritual exercise, but as a genuine shift of focus from what was lacking to what was present. Third, the next day was planned, the priorities were written, the structure was set, and then sleep arrived not as a collapse, but as a deliberate, intentional act of recovery. The quality of sleep changed, and with it, the quality of the mornings changed. The protagonists began waking before the alarm on several of those 7 days. Not because anything forced them awake, but because the body was actually recovering properly, and the mind was ready to engage with the day. Rest had become recovery instead of just unconsciousness. The nights had been given back their purpose, and in doing so, the mornings had been set up for success before they even began. On the morning of the 7th day, after the morning ritual, after the movement, after the writing and the speaking and the intentional first hour, the protagonist stood in front of the mirror. And what they saw was not a dramatically different physical appearance. 7 days is not enough to reshape the body in obvious ways. But what they saw was something far more significant than physical change. They saw a person standing differently, a person whose eyes were more focused, a person whose jaw was set with a quiet determination that had not been visible a week ago. The posture told a story. The expression told a story. The energy in the room told a story. And the story was not about motivation. That is the part that surprised them most. They did not feel a rush of excitement or a wave of emotion. They did not feel inspired in the way that Instagram quotes promise transformation will feel. They felt something quieter and far more powerful than inspiration. They felt in control. Control over the morning. Control over the habits. Control over the language. Control over the choices. The chaos that had existed a week ago had been replaced not with perfection, but with order. Their own order, built by their own hands, one decision at a time. The week had proved something that no motivational speech could have proved through words alone. It had to be proved through living. 7 days of evidence that the person standing in the mirror was capable of discipline, capable of change, capable of showing up for themselves, even when it was hard, even when it was uncomfortable, even when the old patterns were calling loudly. The evidence was in the body. It was in the journal entries. It was in the clarity of the mind. It was in the conversations that had been handled differently. It was in the tasks that had been completed. 7 days of proof that the transformation was not a fantasy. Discipline builds belief in a way that nothing else can. You can read about discipline. You can watch videos about it. You can follow people who talk about it. But until you practice it, until you actually do the hard thing when you do not feel like doing it, the belief never forms. The protagonist understood this now at a level that was no longer intellectual, but experiential. They had felt what it was like to choose the alarm over the snooze, to choose the water over the scrolling, to choose the work over the distraction. And each of those choices, small as they appeared in isolation, had deposited something into an internal account, an account of self-belief that had been overdrawn for years. Momentum is invisible until it is undeniable. At the beginning of day one, there was no momentum, there was only intention. Intention without evidence is fragile. It can be talked out of, reasoned away, or simply eroded by the first moment of discomfort. But by day 3, something had begun to form. By day 5, it was unmistakable. By day 7, it was driving itself. The protagonist did not have to fight as hard to get out of bed on day 7 as they had on day 1. The fighting was still there, but the record of past victories made it shorter, less draining, more manageable. Momentum had become its own fuel. Identity is the deepest level of change, and it is also the last to shift. You can change your behavior for a few days through sheer willpower. You can change your environment to make certain habits easier. But until the identity changes, until the person you believe yourself to be actually updates, the behavioral changes will not last. They will feel like costumes rather than character. The protagonist had started the week believing, somewhere underneath the surface, that they were a person who struggled with discipline, a person who meant well but did not follow through, a person who started things and did not finish them. That belief had been quietly governing their behavior for years. By day 7, that belief had cracks in it. 7 days of consistent action had challenged the old story directly. You cannot continue to believe you are someone who does not follow through when you have evidence, fresh evidence, sitting right in front of you proving otherwise. The identity had not fully transformed yet. Identity change is not a 7-day project, but the foundation had been laid. The cracks in the old story were letting in new light, and that new light was showing the protagonist something they had not been able to see clearly before. That who they were was not fixed. It was a story they had been telling, and they had the power to rewrite it. 7 days were never meant to be the finish line. Anyone who believed that transformation was complete after 1 week was missing the entire point. 7 days were the spark, not the fire. They were the proof that the fire was possible. They were the first chapter, not the whole story. The protagonist understood this with a clarity that felt like relief rather than burden, because the pressure was off. The goal was never to become a completely different person in 1 week. The goal was to prove that change was possible, and that goal had been achieved completely. The new standard had been set, and standards, once genuinely internalized, are nearly impossible to go back from, because going back would require ignoring the evidence. It would require pretending the 7 days did not happen. It would require choosing a smaller version of yourself when you have already tasted a larger one. Most people find that to be psychologically impossible once the threshold has been crossed. The protagonist now knew what their mornings could feel like when protected. They knew what their mind felt like when the noise was removed. They knew what their body felt like when moved with intention. They knew what their nights felt like when ended with dignity. Going back to the old standard would feel like choosing to sleep on the floor when you know what a real bed feels like. Change does not require more time. That is the deepest message of this entire story. You do not need another year. You do not need to wait until January. You do not need to wait until the circumstances feel right, until the stress is lower, until life slows down, until you feel ready. You will never feel ready. Ready is a feeling that follows action, not one that precedes it. The protagonist did not feel ready on the morning of day 1. They felt uncertain and a little afraid and very aware of every way this could go wrong. And they started anyway. And that starting, that single act of beginning without feeling ready, was the most important moment of the entire 7 days. Urgency is not panic. Urgency is the recognition that time is real and finite, and that the life you want to build requires you to begin building it now. Not aggressively, not recklessly, but with the clear awareness that waiting has a cost. Every day spent living on autopilot is a day of potential that does not return. The protagonist felt that urgency on the first morning and let it fuel the action rather than paralyze it. Urgency pointed at purpose becomes extraordinary momentum. Urgency without direction becomes anxiety. The difference is the decision that precedes it. Transformation is not a feeling. It is a daily practice of execution. It is the accumulation of small, consistent, intentional actions done over enough time to create visible results. The protagonist did not wake up on day 7 feeling transformed in some dramatic, movie-like way. They felt something far more real than that. They felt the satisfaction of someone who showed up for themselves every day for 7 consecutive days. They felt the quiet pride of someone who made commitments and kept them. They felt the groundedness of someone who now had evidence, real personal evidence, that they were capable of the life they had been dreaming about. Becoming unrecognizable was never about the outside. It was always about the inside. The body changes slowly. The bank account changes slowly. The relationships and career and circumstances of life change slowly. But the internal experience of living inside a disciplined, intentional, purposeful day changes immediately. From the very first protected morning, the internal experience of life was different. From the very first cut habit, the identity began its quiet rewrite. From the very first night ended with reflection and planning, the relationship with tomorrow changed. The outside will follow the inside, it always does. But the inside is where the transformation lives first. 1 week can change the entire direction of a life. Not because 7 days is a long time, but Because 7 days of genuine commitment creates the kind of internal evidence that reshapes how a person sees themselves. And how a person sees themselves is the single greatest determinant of what they will do next, and the day after that, and the year after that. The protagonist who stood in front of the mirror on morning 7 was not the same person who had reached for the phone on morning 1. Not because 7 days had passed, but because 7 days had been fully lived. Every hour of those 7 days had been lived with intention, with awareness, with the kind of presence that most people spend their entire lives chasing and never finding. The 7 days were not the destination. They were the beginning of a new standard. And a new standard, once established, becomes the floor rather than the ceiling. What was difficult on day 1 became automatic by day 7. What required full willpower at the beginning required only habit by the end. And that is how transformation actually works over time. You raise the floor. You make the new standard the minimum, not the maximum. And then, from that higher floor, you look up again and see the next level clearly. Then you begin again. Not from scratch, but from a stronger foundation. The 7 days were proof. The rest of a lifetime is the practice